Welcome to you all. So, as you say, my name's David Sutherland. I work for Bucks Council, and today's all about local niche recovery strategies and a bit about the process that we're about to go through, and hopefully giving you some insight in terms of how you can be engaged in the process of obviously the local niche recovery strategy we're producing for Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. Just from a personal perspective, my role at Buckinghamshire Council, so I'm responsible for some of the new policies that the government have put in place via the Environment Act, so of which local niche recovery strategies is one. I'm also responsible for the introduction of biodiversity net gain in the planning system within Buckinghamshire, so they're kind of a very I suppose joint policies. They're going to work together. So that's my my remit. I was fortunate to be part of one of the pilot local niche recovery strategies. So the government ran 5 pilots a couple of years ago to test the process, and I think it's through that I really understood that the power and importance of these. And I suppose the fabulous opportunity that we've got in terms of kind of pulling these together. I mean, they are one of the key policies that the government is putting in place under the Environment Act to support, I suppose, their legally binding commitment to reverse nature's decline. Nicola, one of the project team, is going to just cover slightly just in terms of, Buckinghamshire nature, but obviously, we'll all be very aware of, I suppose, the unfortunate nature's decline and what we need to do to reverse that. And for nature to recover at the scale required, what we need is targeted, coordinated, and more importantly, collaborative action in the right places. And I think this is what this is all about. This hopefully brings that together. It will spatially identify. So what's good about this, it will spatially identify those areas and locations where action to restore nature, to create habitats, will be most effective. And it's there, and I suppose, to be intended as a guide, whether it be the public sector, us as a local authority, whether it be private sector, whether it be kind of developers or businesses, whether it be the voluntary sector, land managers, or whether as a parish council much more local in terms of what action should be taken and where, and how that collective action can have the greatest impact in terms of the priorities and measures that we're looking to kind of carry out to restore nature in Buckinghamshire. So thank you for your interest. Thank you to those that have joined. Next slide, please, Saatchi. So yes, this is fundamentally a partnership in terms of how we're looking to kind of take this forward. So yes, you have a kind of like a core team that's, I suppose, guiding this through the process. So as you said, there's myself from Buckinghamshire Council. We've got Phil Snell on the call from Milton Keynes City Council. In terms of our local nature partnership, we have Nicola Thomas, who's the partnership manager, and Saatchi, who's the local nature recovery strategy project manager. And we're kind of, I suppose, the core team, and I should not forget Sarah. My apologies, Sarah. So we have Sarah from Natural England, who I suppose is our link into central government to ensure that we're, I suppose, following the correct process as we kind of go along. So that's kind of our core team. We're all on the call today, and you'll hear from each and every one of those as we kind of move through. I suppose supporting that, we have a steering group as we kind of move through the process. So as well as those people, we have our Environmental Records Centre, which hold all of our environmental records. The Environment Agency, so kind of focused on the water environment, predominantly. We have our Wildlife Trust, the Milton Keynes Park Trust, our Protected Landscape, so the Children's Conservation Board, and the Forestry Commission. And together, I suppose that's our. I'm hoping we're hitting the relevant expertises to kind of guide the project through. But clearly, this whole process works where there is collaboration across the board in terms of people who are involved in the process, from, I suppose, land managers, as you say, to parish councils. Everyone, ideally needs to play a part in terms of what the priorities are, but how we then ultimately then go on to deliver this moving forward. So that's just a bit about, I suppose, who's working on it and how we're looking to put it into place. Next slide, please, Sachi. A bit about the housekeeping. So I've kind of mentioned the timing, around about half an hour in terms of the slides. We'll then open it up to questions at the end. It is recorded, so for those that are unable to attend, we will send out a recording so they can kind of catch up on the back of that. And just so you're aware that any comments you kind of put in the chat or Q&A, that's not captured as part of the recording. Just so you're aware, the cameras and mics are automatically off, just to avoid any of the kind of background disturbance. Please do use the chat function, the Q&A function, ideally to put your questions as we go along. We'll either answer those as we're going, or we'll pick them up at the end. And there will be a couple of interactive polls as we go along, so please, the links will be posted in the chat, or there'll be a QR code which you can use your smartphone. So please do take part in those interactive polls as we go along. So just turning now to the agenda in terms of what we're going to cover in the next kind of half hour or slightly less than that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hand over to Sarah first. Sarah is going to, I suppose, set out what a local nature recovery strategy is, kind of the rules and regulations that we're going to have to follow and the process that we're following, and just, I suppose, why does it matter? So that's a bit about the nuts and bolts of a local nature recovery strategy and how it works and how it's supposed to interact with other policies as well, and the planning system. We're then going to hand over to Nicola from the Local Nature Partnership, and Nicola is then going to, I suppose, look a little bit about our nature across Buckinghamshire in Milton Keynes. What is it that we, I suppose, are trying to recover and restore? What are the important things that we've got here? And then finally, we will then hand over to Sachi, who's going to pick up a section about how you can get involved. How's this going to impact residents? What's the process that we're going to go through? How do you engage with it? How can you get involved perhaps more proactively? So we'll pick that up at the end, and then we'll wrap up the session with the questions and answers, and hopefully we'll be done and you can get back to your evening by around about 7:45, 7:50. But in the meantime, I hope that sets out the structure we're going to follow. I'm going to hand over to Sarah in terms of, I suppose, what a local nature recovery strategy is. So over to you, Sarah. So my apologies, a quick poll first. This is a bit of a, I suppose, a pulse in terms of what do you know about local nature recovery strategies in terms of your knowledge to date. So if you could either go to the poll in the chat, complete that. It's essentially just, what's your understanding or level of understanding of these to date? Don't know very much, somewhat, yes, you know a lot about it. And this is, I think, just to us gauge people's level of knowledge as we proceed through the journey of the local nature recovery strategy and what it is we need to do, I suppose, to bring people up to speed. So as we proceed through the presentation, Sachi will just put some of the results into the chat as we proceed. So thank you for completing that. And at this point, I will hand over to Sarah to set out what a local nature recovery strategy is. So over to you, Sarah.
Great, thanks, David. So as David mentioned, I'm Sarah from Natural England, and I'm here to help guide Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes through the LNRS process. Next slide. So just a little bit about the context for the LNRS. These are new strategies for nature. They are legally required by the Environment Act, and every part of England is going to have a local nature recovery strategy. So as you might have picked up by now, our local strategy covers both Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. And this sits, so it's legally required, but it sits within a wider environmental policy context as well. So up there on the slide is the Environmental Improvement Plan. That's a government document that sets out key goals and objectives and targets for nature. And it makes very clear that LNRSs are a key mechanism for helping to achieve these environmental goals. The sort of headline goals are there on the right-hand side. So don't worry too much about the detail, but each of those goals is accompanied by objectives and targets, and they're all feeding towards this apex goal at the top of thriving plants and wildlife. So the LNRS is going to be working towards that and the other kind of relevant related goals. And just as a little caveat, we are expecting some further guidance from government about the relationship between LNRS and national targets and which targets we need to think about. So there might be some that are outside of these on the screen here, but this is definitely a good flavour of the sort of goals that we have nationally. Next slide. So what actually is the LNRS? It is, as we mentioned, it is a strategy for nature. It's going to be developed through a collaborative process. So that's that group of people that David mentioned at the beginning, but also you. And we want to get as many people and businesses and organisations in the area involved as we can. The strategy itself consists of two parts. There's a written part, which is called the Statement of Biodiversity Priorities. And that's going to look at what nature we already have in the area, priorities, which is what are the top things that we collectively want for nature in the area, and measures, which is simply what actually needs to be done to deliver those priorities. The second part is a map called the Local Habitat Map. And again, that looks at mapping what we've already got, particularly in terms of sites that are protected, already designated for nature conservation. And then looking at where we can implement those priorities and measures. So mapping them and seeing where, if we deliver them, they make the biggest difference to nature and also provide other environmental benefits. So I'm going to touch on that a bit more later. But really, we want to get the biggest bang for our buck about where we're focusing our efforts. There might also be some measures that could be applied across the area, and it doesn't really matter where they go. So we can definitely still include those, but they just don't need to be mapped. As David already touched on, there were some pilots done for this. So this is the first time that LNRSs are being produced. It is very early days. But Buckinghamshire without Milton Keynes was one of 5 pilot areas, and the purpose of the pilots was very much to help test the process, and that's fed into regulations and guidance which have since been published. Nevertheless, through that process there was over 1,000 responses, and 54 priorities were identified, and there was also mapping work done to look at where those priorities were best delivered. So we will, whilst the pilot it was never intended to be a finished product, we will be looking at the information that fed into that and kind of reviewing it, seeing if it's still relevant and integrating that with the inputs that we get from this process as well. So we are going to draw on that work where relevant. But yeah, just as again, a bit of a caveat, actually how it might look at the end and the methodology that we will use might be different from the pilot. So there are quite a lot of changes, but there's some useful information that we can still integrate into this process. Next slide. So this is just a flow diagram of the process that we expect to be following over the next 12 to 18 months. The left-hand side are all the things that feed into the map, and the right-hand side are the things that feed into that written part, the Statement of Biodiversity Priorities. So step 1 is that mapping areas that are already important for nature, particularly, as I mentioned, those designated sites. Step 3 is describing the strategy area. Again, that's the written element of what's already there. But that will go wider than just the designated sites. Step 4 is agreeing those priorities and the measures. So what do we want? How are we going to get there? Step 5 is then putting that on a map. And yes, I have deliberately missed out step 2, and that's because these strategies are going to be reviewed every 3 to 10 years. And step 2 comes in at the review stage. And what that's doing is mapping areas where action has been taken for nature recovery. So that means when we come to review the strategy, and then subsequent reviews in the future as well, we're going to look at what's happened in between and what's been achieved, and record that in the strategy itself. Next slide, please. So just to run you through a very kind of quick example, looking first at the priority, so the what do we want? That could be we want more woodland. Then we look at the measures, so how are we going to get there? That could be we will plant trees to expand and connect existing woodland. And then we move on to that mapping element. So where is this going to happen? Well, if we're going to connect and expand existing woodland, we'll need to start with where the existing woodland is. But we could also think about sort of tree planting and woodland creation around towns, for example, to help bring those other benefits like cleaner air, shade, local cooling, nice places to go for walks. Next slide. So why does it matter? So as I've mentioned, there's kind of the main driver from LNRS has come from government policy, but there's sort of a lot of different things going on that all will feed in, integrate together to work towards achieving and actually delivering the LNRS. So biodiversity net gain, that top one, is a national policy mechanism, and that will require all new development to increase biodiversity by 10%. The emphasis is very much on delivering that on the development site itself, so where the biodiversity will be lost. But it's expected that some of that will need to be delivered off-site. And the LNRS will be really key to determining where those sites are. And the way that that net gain is calculated actually incentivizes developers to choose options that will deliver the local nature recovery strategy. There's also, since the Environment Act, a strengthened biodiversity duty on public authorities. And what that means is that they have to conserve and enhance biodiversity and agree and enact policies to achieve that. So the LNRS could form a good kind of framework for that. The local nature recovery strategies, the sort of way that they've been designed, or that the process has been designed, is with planning and the planning system in mind. So for example, that's why the boundaries are Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. So it's one strategy, but it goes around the boundaries of those planning authorities. And that there's going to be some further guidance again coming from government about what that relationship should be. But it is required that planning authorities have to have regard to the LNRS. So we'll get a bit more clarity on what that means. But there's definitely an ambition for them to be integrated. The next bullet point down is environmental land management schemes. So this is a new system of government grants for farmers and landowners to support the delivery of environmental targets. So that could be taking actions to improve water quality or air quality, or increase biodiversity on their land. So that's likely also to be quite a key delivery mechanism for the local nature recovery strategy. And then there's likely to be a whole host of kind of future public and private funding and incentives to help deliver this strategy. So, for example, there's already things like biodiversity net gain, which I've mentioned, as well as things like carbon credits, so quite a lot of new markets, as well as charitable grants and the work of the work of a lot of organisations that are already doing very good work in Bucks. But what the local nature recovery strategy will really help do is kind of join all that work up, so it all makes it's all kind of contributing to a bigger picture. Next slide. So I'm sure when I say nature, that conjures up an image for you about what that is. And when we're talking about nature, we are, I've just seen a comment saying someone can't hear. So if anyone else can't hear, if you could just pop a message in, which if you can't hear, you probably can't hear that. But hopefully it's just a one-off. So yeah, nature includes habitats such as wetlands, woodlands, grasslands, and many, many more. It also includes species, so that might be specific animals or plants or fungi. But it also includes the wider landscape, so that's things like water and geology and soils. And those are quite important because they dictate where those habitats and species can actually exist. And I also wanted to just highlight that nature doesn't just exist in the countryside. So as we go through the process, we want to be thinking about both urban and rural nature. Next slide. So why is healthy nature important? Hopefully you will all agree that nature has its own value, so it's important for its own sake, but it also provides a whole host of benefits that are essential for us to live and thrive. And those benefits are known as ecosystem services. As you can see on the slide here, they are generally grouped into 4 different types: cultural, goods or provisioning services, regulating services, and supporting services. But what this really means is the fact that we recognise nature gives us things like nice, pleasant areas to live and work and socialise. It gives us a lot of things. So the goods like food and water, medicine, raw materials. Then it also provides, helps clean the air, gives us clean water. And then in that supporting services, that's kind of the processes that underlie all of this, that keep nature working to provide us with all these other benefits. So I'm sure you can kind of all relate to some of this as residents in the area, about places that you like to go in the area. Maybe you've noticed that nature benefits your mental health, gives you nice places to go for recreation. Maybe you've got children who are involved in kind of forest school schemes and it's providing education, protecting your home from flooding. There's lots and lots of things that nature does for us. So I will now pass over to Nicola, who's going to give you a brief overview of the nature in Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes.
Thank you, Sarah. Hopefully, Mary, you're able to hear now. If you can't, then just pop another comment in the chat and we'll do what we can to help. And everyone else, I hope you can hear me okay. I'll assume you can and carry on. So just a reminder, I'm Nicola Thomas. I'm the Partnership Manager for the Bucks and Milton Keynes Natural Environment Partnership, which is the local nature partnership for the area. Thanks to Sarah, she's outlined what a local nature recovery strategy is and the various links to the wider government policy. My role is to give a bit more information on why we're putting together a strategy to recover nature. So in this section, I'll give you a quick reminder of some of the key habitats and species in our area. There's lots more that you can find on our NEP website if you'd like to understand a bit more about all of that. Also look at why they matter, so what's important about those habitats and species in terms of the wildlife that lives there, but also those wider benefits that they provide us with. And we'll also acknowledge the threats that nature faces, and therefore that's where the local nature recovery strategy comes in terms of what we can do to help. So before I start with my slides, I just want to warn you, I suppose, that we're going to have a poll at the end of my slides that will ask you what nature recovery means to you. So that particular phrase, nature recovery. So it might be something that you want to have a think about as we go through these slides. And there'll be a QR code, and we'll also put a link in the chat to a poll where you can give your ideas to us on what nature recovery means. It's something that we need to define collaboratively as part of the work that we're doing on the local nature recovery strategy. So we'll be really keen to hear from you at the end of this little section. Okay, first slide, please, Sachi. Thank you. So these 2 pie charts really give a quick comparison of the land use types, broad sort of categories of land use across Buckinghamshire, Milton Keynes. The biodiversity value will vary between these categories, but this is just the sort of categories themselves. And there are some key similarities that stand out and some differences. So, for example, you can see that about 2/3 of the land cover is made up of cultivated land or amenity and improved grassland. The proportions vary slightly in Bucks and Milton Keynes, but around about 2/3 of the land is for that use. There are some key differences as well. So in Buckinghamshire, slightly more woodland, trees and scrub by land area than there are in Milton Keynes. And you can see some other differences too, sort of highlighted, but essentially this shows that both areas do have quite a variety of habitats and land use. So let's delve into a little bit more detail and pick out some of the key habitats. So let's starting with woodland. This picture's from Ashridge, which remind us that we have, as well as patches of woodland across the area, we have some ancient woodland in our area, which is really important for species such as some rare mammals, species such as hazel dormice, bats as well, and some rare butterflies. In terms of trees themselves, to just pick on one type of tree, in the Aylesbury Vale, we've got black poplar trees, and those native black poplar trees are nationally important, but a declining species. So we're lucky to have all of this around us. Wider benefits of trees and woodland, clearly, as well as providing habitats for nature. They provide us with the raw material of timber, but also growing trees capture carbon, they provide shade, improve our air quality, and obviously can reduce flood risk and prevent soil erosion. So looking at another habitat that we've picked out for you, just as a reminder, so just moving to the next slide. The Chilterns, a very specialised and fragile landscape, and within here we've picked out the chalk grasslands, which is a managed habitat, and they're important because they contain and provide home for various specialised plants, including orchids, as well as butterflies and invertebrates. And the Chilterns is the only place that you'll find the county flower of Buckinghamshire, the Chilterns gentian. In terms of the wider benefits of these chalk grasslands and the Chilterns as a whole, obviously the habitats for wildlife really important, and provision of pollinator services. So some of these habitats will attract pollinators, which are obviously vital for crop growth. And the Chilterns is obviously also a big visitor attraction. So people go there to visit for recreation, and so it provides benefits to people's mental and physical health and well-being. Staying with the Chilterns, but just moving on to the next example of habitats there, chalk streams like this one pictured here, the River Chess. They're an internationally rare habitat. Most of the world's chalk streams are in England, and a lot of those are in the Chilterns. And chalk streams have unique properties which support a huge range of aquatic plants such as watercress, animals like the water vole, fish populations such as brown trout, and various aquatic invertebrates. Wider benefits as well as providing these habitat sources, clearly health and well-being, and a site for recreation and access. Moving to the next slide, and just keeping with our water environment, broadening out to other water bodies across our Milton Keynes and Buckinghamshire area. So thinking about the large river systems such as the River Great Ouse, but also the River Tame, the Ray, and right down in the south of Bucks, the Thames, which forms the boundary along the south part of Buckinghamshire. But also we want to include in this sort of category the wider water network, so all the other water bodies and tributaries and streams and ponds and the slow flowing brooks in the Aylesbury Vale, and all the associated wetland habitats. So why are these all important? Well, in terms of wildlife, they clearly support a wide range of fish and plants and invertebrates. The wetland areas surrounding some of the river systems that we have are really important for a number of species, including wading birds. So, for example, in the Upper Ray Valley, the floodplain meadow grassland is really important for lapwing and curlew. The wider benefits that the river system and all our water bodies provide, as well as supporting wildlife and being a source of water, wetlands themselves can help manage flood risk, of course, and waterscapes again attract visitors. Moving to our final kind of picture slide of examples of habitats around Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. Is this one from Milton Keynes to remind us that urban nature is obviously very important. And what do we mean by urban nature? Well, all the parks, the gardens, the street trees, all the examples of nature on people's doorsteps in urban areas. And they provide really important services like shade and local climate regulation, better air quality, perhaps noise barriers from some main roads, and they make places attractive to live in and work in. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour around some of our habitats and species and some of those wider benefits that they provide that we've got on our doorstep. There's many more precious habitats that I haven't shown you pictures of, but we could, for example, mention our hedgerows or traditional orchards or our arable field margins where we've actually got some quite rare arable weeds growing, or ancient box woodland that we've got examples of, and the various areas of protected areas within Bucks and Milton Keynes that we probably visit that have nationally rare species that might be under threat. The key message really is that our nature is all around us and it is precious and it provides us with many, many benefits. However, let's move to the next slide. As we're all aware, our nature is under threat. So globally, we are in the middle of a mass extinction event. And in the UK, 41% of our species have declined in recent decades. Across Bucks and Milton Keynes, all of our chalk streams need improvement, and we're losing plant species at a greater rate than a lot of other counties in England. There are a variety of pressures that nature is facing at all scales. So the big and obvious one that's in the news at the moment as well is really climate change. So the warmer, wetter winters, the hotter, drier summers, and the impacts of that changing climate to the types of species that might be able to be resilient for that in that changing climate. Types of species might need to change. We're getting increasing numbers of different pests and diseases and non-native species. So we need to think about what that means for our native, our sort of native plants and animals. Other pressures, perhaps more local ones, development pressure. So our area in Bucks and Milton Keynes faces huge development pressure, and with that potentially could come habitat loss depending on where that development is placed. And more people to our area is likely to mean an increase in demand for some of those resources such as water, and potentially an increase in waste and pollution. So we need to think really carefully about what we do with that and how we deal with that. Another sort of pressure might come from how we manage our land. So, for example, changes in land ownership can also lead to smaller parcels of land being owned and therefore some fragmented types of management, which can lead to fragmented habitats. And how we manage land around our water systems can affect both the water quality in rivers and the hydrology of the river, so the actual what the river channel looks like and what that means for the habitats and species there. So there are a lot of threats that nature's facing, but we do acknowledge there are already some examples of some brilliant work already being done across Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes to try and combat those threats and work against those challenges by organisations, individuals and our farmers. So the local nature recovery strategy will form a strategic plan so that all of these efforts and future efforts really pull together and work together towards one common set of goals for maximum impact. And that's what we can all do in order to protect the nature, protect that we have around us, protect the benefits it provides us with, and help work against these threats. So that's where the LNRS comes in. Which brings me on to the last slide of my section, and as promised, there'll be a link in the chat in just a second. There's a QR code on your screen. Please follow whichever one you're more comfortable with. And what we'd like you to do while I'm just talking through this slide and throughout the rest of the presentation would be to let us know what you think of when we say nature recovery. So what does that term mean to you? In yellow on your screen, you'll see our working definition that we've put together as a steering group with some of our stakeholder working groups at the moment. So we've emphasised things like working together, repair and creating resilient habitats and landscapes. We've emphasised wildlife, those wider benefits, and obviously mentioning both Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes in that broader definition. But we need to come up with a definition together that we can all get behind. So what does nature recovery mean to you? What do you think about when we say, when we talk about recovering nature in Buckinghamshire and in Milton Keynes? And do you have any thoughts that you can add to that definition? If you do, please use the QR code or go to the link and tell us what you think, and we can work to build your ideas into our collective definition. So thanks for listening to me. I'm going to pass over now to Saatchi, who will let you know about how you can get engaged with the LNRS process. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicola. I'm just going to take a quick look at the poll. There seem to be some responses coming in. So some of the responses include habitats and landscapes, protection. Thank you for those responses. If you have more ideas on how we should define nature recovery for our area of Bucks and Milton Keynes, please do send them in through the poll, or and we'll be sure to look at all of them and incorporate them into that collective definition. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about how, well, first, why you might want to get involved as residents in the LNRS process, and then how you could do so. Excuse me. Right, so as was mentioned a few times earlier in this presentation, nature has benefits for everyone and can affect all our day-to-day lives. So, for example, it could help regulate the impact of floods, or access to green space has shown to have significant positive impacts on people's health and well-being. And essentially, ultimately, preserving nature around you has a myriad of benefits, and we really do hope that you will want to participate in having a say in how it is managed in your local area and your neighborhood. The LNRS could also be an opportunity for you to participate in the process of recovering nature in your local areas. So in terms of the how, we're currently at an early stage in developing the LNRS. Yes, we went through the pilot process, and we will be incorporating some of the learnings from that process and some of the data that we gathered. But at this point, we're really trying to reach as wide a group as possible in terms of various different stakeholders, including residents across both Bucks and Milton Keynes. And we'd really, really like your views on which parts of nature are most important to preserve, improve, and restore. And this will essentially inform a series of priorities for nature, as well as the measures that can be taken to achieve these goals, which is the crux of the LNRS. So if I can request you all to take a really quick survey today and provide your opinions on priorities for nature, the link is in the chat, or you can use the QR code that's on the screen as well. That would be very, very helpful. We also have a stakeholder engagement group and the stakeholder consultation group that will meet in November of this year and June of next year for 2 hours. And we'd hope that some of you, all of you, might be interested in joining that group to ensure that your priorities for nature are being met. And again, you can register your interest in participating in those groups, in those meets, via the link or the QR code. We also want to hear from you how else you would like to be engaged, whether there are specific ways in which you would like to be engaged, or if there's other information that you would like to hear from us. Again, through the QR code and or the link, you can access the survey and let us know. And finally, if we'd love for you to become champions of the LNRS, tell your neighbors, friends, family about the LNRS, and ask them to take the survey so that we can get as many responses and have a robust understanding of how residents view nature in their local areas in Bucks and Milton Keynes, and what they would like to see in terms of improvement, restoration, for for nature's sake, but also for the very valuable ecosystem services that it provides. So with that, I'm going to move to the Q&A round. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll pick them up. If we're not able to get to all your questions today, we will make sure that we email you with responses. We will also email you the QR code or the link to the survey and some FAQs, as well as some information that you can pass along to anybody else you think might be interested in learning about the LNRS. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. So the first question is, assessing habitats for nature recovery requires us to understand the potential for restoration of poorly managed habitats. But my impression from the Bucks nature recovery pilot was that it tended not to identify poorly managed areas as much as already well recognized for their potential. How will the LNRS be different? So if I can hand this one over to Sarah and David, if you would like to take that.
Happy to pick that up as a starter. So you're right. So I think so obviously we were testing a process. I think that's the important thing to point out as part of the pilot. What did become apparent was when we were looking at our data sources. So this time we're going to have the national data sets given to us and our local data sets. I think what became really apparent, and as a point you've picked up, is that we didn't have up-to-date data on the condition of our habitats, and that was really became apparent. And I think that's a national issue. And I think on the back of that, we then commissioned some habitat condition data so we can understand better the condition of our habitat. So it's a point that's really well made. I mean, it's not just a point about creating habitat. We might have high quality habitat that needs to be improved and managed better. So good point. I think we've got some lessons learned from the pilot in terms of the data sets we're using, how we look at condition. Clearly, we're trying to establish, a cohesive network that makes sense, that kind of joins those kind of high quality areas in terms of looking at a creation. But clearly, we need to build into the actions how we're going to maintain and enhance those core areas as well. So really good question. And Sarah, I don't know, Nicola, if you've got anything to add to that.
I can just add, I suppose, sorry, Sarah, I can just add, I suppose it sort of emphasises or highlights that the opportunity really to get involved with the LNRS process and tell us about what you believe the priorities are in your area, so that we make sure that we pick up what's important to you. So just on top of what David said, I guess that sort of highlights the need to sort of encourage participation in the LNRS so that we do pick up all these ideas of what the priorities should be and where they should be. Thank you. Sarah, have you got anything else, or should we move?
No, I think you've covered it. We'll move on.
Great, thank you. We have another question that asks, in Milton Keynes, we have recently lost some areas of priority habitat to planning approvals despite resistance from ecology officers. Would the LNRS enable us to prevent this? Phil and Sarah, can I hand that over to you?
Well, I can say, obviously, when priority habitat it has certain protections. It is regrettable. We've lost some areas that have gone to the planning inspectorate, so they take a view on the balance of things. One of the issues, though, is to do with mapping, and things like the priority habitat areas were mapped a very long while ago. And that doesn't necessarily mean the quality of those sites has retained. And quite often the initial surveys were quite brief. They were walkovers by, very, very skilled people, I'm sure. But they, kind of took quite a broad brush approach to what they were looking at because of speed. So sometimes, in actual fact, we discover habitat through ecological surveys of developments that we didn't know would qualify as priority habitat. So there's an area in MK East which wasn't mapped as priority habitat, and actually because it's on private land, nobody has any right to go onto the land, but the ecological surveys came back and the reference and the quality, etc., pointed to that it would qualify as priority habitat, NG5 lowland meadow. So we managed to get some of that protected as part of the development. So local nature recovery strategies are a strategy. All the pertinent law and standing and everything for particular sites, it's under the Wildlife and Countryside Act and NPPF and things like that. So it clearly does affect both development and where we would see improvements, but it doesn't necessarily give any extra protection to priority habitats, unfortunately.
David, would you like to come in?
Just to add to that, obviously what this doesn't do is we have all the existing legal protections in place in terms of how the planning system operates, and as Phil says, the guidance within the national planning policy framework in terms of those protections still exist. The way that this has been, I suppose, designed is to work hand in hand with the planning system. So the intent is that clearly, both in terms of, I suppose, development management, but also in terms of local plan making. So the idea is, we would sincerely hope this is going to be an excellent evidence base for, new local plans, emerging local plans, in terms of how we're spatially looking at the area. The key bit of information is we're, I suppose, waiting for that kind of key bit of guidance from the government in terms of how local planning authorities have to have regard to local nature recovery strategies. And that, I think, will then set out the detail in terms of the specifics of how, the two work together. But clearly, the two have been designed so that they work very closely hand in hand. So just to give you kind of just some assurance on that.
Thanks, David. There's another question in the chat that asks about hoping to hear how areas where action is required have been identified. I would also like to know how we can submit suggestions for new sites to be considered for special attention. Sarah, would you like to take that?
Yeah, so just to clarify, no sites in terms of that mapping element have been identified yet, so that's still open. And the first step for kind of contributing to that is fill out the survey that we've got up there. And there also, as Sachi has touched on, this is not the only time that we want to hear from you. So there's going to be more opportunities. So do fill that out. There's also a bit to sign up if you want to kind of stay in the loop about what's happening with the LNRS as well. But yeah, by all means, we'd love your input.
There's a question that asks, will all the counties across the UK share their learning and plans with each other so we have a coordinated plan? Yes, there are elements of the LNRS, such as the baseline map, that is meant to harmonize and create a nature recovery network across the UK. We also are coordinating closely with our neighbouring authorities, as well as communicating more generally with authorities, with responsible authorities across the country, to ensure that we're learning from each other, and especially with our neighbouring authorities where it's relevant, we're developing strategies for certain areas together. What would the positive impact be of listing currently important sites? Sarah?
Yes, so in terms of that, the first, I think it's the step one that you're referring to there, which is the mapping the sites that are already of importance, particularly the protected sites. And that's really to set out the context, I guess, for the LNRS, and also just to kind of note that on that, which I think might link in a little bit to a question about collaboration, but all of the local nature recovery strategies have some key things that they have to include on that initial map. So it also helps kind of build that bigger picture of what we've already got. And then further down the line, once we've kind of talked about our priorities and measures, it might be, if relevant, that knowledge of what we've already got can help us decide where new habitat or other interventions can make a difference. So it might be that there's opportunities to link them up or something like that. But by all means, that kind of end mapping, that step 5, isn't solely constrained to those. So it's kind of for context, and it will inform the process as we go along. But it's by all means, action won't be restricted to those areas.
Thanks, Sarah. There's a question about whether you will receive a copy of the slides for those who don't have time to listen to the recording. Yes, we can send you the slides. We will also send you a quick sort of FAQ sheet. So that'll be a quick read and touch upon the sort of general content that was discussed today and some of the questions that have come up as well. Does Bucks and Milton Keynes actually have any central funding for delivery of the LNRS targets? What happens if targets are missed? David?
Yeah, so really good question. So obviously we've been awarded some funding to produce this, but I think what's really important is that effectively what it's going to do, the government has kind of set up a whole number of funding streams in terms of to support nature recovery, and that could be via a whole variety of channels. So we have the new biodiversity net gain, where developers will obviously have to enhance their own development sites. If they can't, it will be required to be delivered off-site. So that's going to create habitat in its own right, and will be some of the funding to help deliver what we're looking at. There's a whole new woodland creation grants that the government set up in terms of supporting its woodland creation targets. Now, the local nature recovery strategy will help guide where's it going to make best sense to utilise that funding. Where does it make best sense that we're going to get best value, both in terms of woodland creation, but perhaps also thinking about, well, how's that going to enhance local flood protection as well? So I think that's the idea behind this, is that the local nature recovery strategy is effectively the guide to funnel all manner of funding streams. And that's, for instance, like the new environmental land management scheme that's going to obviously reward land managers and farmers in terms of how land is managed. Again, the intention is obviously to link in terms of the priorities that are being set up in the local nature recovery strategy. So hopefully that kind of gives an idea that there's a whole manner of funding streams, whether they be private, the government, or whether they be kind of the new carbon credits in terms of a private market. This is the kind of the guide to how we want that collective funding to be delivered locally. So hopefully that gives you the flavour of obviously how it's intended to be delivered.
Thanks, David. There's a question about how will the local habitat map for the area be produced? Will it work off the existing data collected through phase 1-2 habitat surveys already completed in the area, or something else? Sarah, can I direct that to you, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So the habitat map will be developed in 2 stages. The first one, as I've mentioned, will be those protected designated wildlife sites, and also irreplaceable habitats, which I haven't mentioned yet, but that's quite a kind of prescriptive what that background data is. And then the end product, when we're looking at where are the best places to actually deliver the priorities and measures, that will be a whole host of information that will come from various sources. So there's a collection of data that's being put together by Natural England for responsible authorities. So Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes have access to that, and that's data expected to feed into the process. That's all stuff that's national and publicly available. And then we can add in any sort of local data sources that we have as well. So to kind of address the bit in your question about phase 1 or 2 habitat surveys, that's, I would imagine, probably a bit too detailed and also a bit too patchy across the area. Obviously that will only relate to certain sites. But there is, you know, lots of really useful local data that we can feed in that can help make those decisions, and that we can use in our sort of consultation process going forward. So, for example, we've got, as David mentioned right at the very beginning, we are working with the local record centre and the records that they have as well as other data sets. So yeah, there's a lot feeding into it, and hopefully it will be useful. But again, if you're aware of sort of any other local data sets across the county that you think that we should be thinking about, then do flag those up as well.
Thanks, Sarah. There is a question about sorry, just looking through our chat. About any plans to ban the use of pesticides. So just to say that that's not necessarily within the scope of the LNRS, but
So actually, I can pick that up.
Sure, go ahead.
If it's of help. So I think what I would say is, again, a really important point. I think it kind of points to another part of the Environment Act, which has placed an enhanced duty on local authorities in terms of their enhanced duty in terms of all that they do, in terms of their policies and their functions. So all local authorities will have to look at their own functions in terms of what they're doing to enhance biodiversity under that duty. So that's kind of one of the things, just that, you know, we as a local authority will have to pick up also in terms of, you know, our verge management, how our parks are managed, all our functions we're going to need to look at to, I suppose, comply with that new duty. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of, that's one really good point, but one that we will need to kind of pick up as part of that wider consideration of the functions that we're kind of that we're looking at. So hopefully, yes, it's addressed, but another part of the Environment Act, not necessarily to be delivered through the local niche recovery strategy. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thanks, David.
I was going to say, yeah, go on, Such. I was just saying, I'm just wondering if there's any more, just looking at time. We've kind of got a minute left, but if there's any other key ones that have kind of come up.
I think we can answer maybe one more question, and if there's anything else that we missed out, we'll definitely answer that for you in the email that we send out. So there's one about, will the habitat map be updated regularly so that newly reported species will be included?
Yeah, so, I'll just jump in because I've just popped in a type response to that. So yeah, the habitat map will be updated. So I mentioned that the whole LNRS will be reviewed every 3 to 10 years. So when we come to do the next round, it will be updated. It legally can't be updated in between without input from, without a sort of agreement from the Secretary of State. So if there was a really key reason why something had to be updated, then it is possible. But given that these strategies are kind of working on a 5-year cycle, or roughly within that 3 to 10 years, so we expect it's going to be about a 5-year cycle, that should be kind of sufficient to capture those updates each time that relate to that version of the strategy.
Thanks, Sarah. There's also a question about how the LNRS will cope with HS2. David, if you'd like to take that, and then I think we should end after.
So good question. You know, clearly we cannot ignore HS2 and the other you know, national infrastructure projects that are you know, affecting Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. I think it's worth pointing out, obviously, from Buckinghamshire's perspective, we were wholly opposed to HS2 from the start in terms of and have obviously sought to maximise obviously any mitigation. You know, what you know, what this will do, I think, is look at the whole in terms of where we need to restore nature across the whole. So as part of the pilot, we mapped the kind of the route of HS2 and East-West Rail. So we incorporated that in terms of our mapping, with a view that, where is it that we're going to need to kind of connect habitat, recognizing that that's happened. This is a document for the future in terms of how we kind of work with future and I suppose guide future growth. So, I mean, yes, we have to recognize it. But obviously what we're trying here is obviously how do we guide nature recovery going ahead? And as you say, the important thing going ahead is that, yes, this does link to the planning system moving forward. It links to biodiversity net gain, and we know moving forward that national infrastructure projects are going to have to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain in terms of future national infrastructure projects. So I hope that kind of picks up the response. I know not ideal, but it's a recognition of what we've got and now what we're working with at a local level. So I'm just conscious of the time. It's now 2 minutes past 8, and I'm hoping that this introduction has given you a flavour of what local nature recovery strategies are, the process we're going to follow, why you're really important in terms of whether you're kind of just a local resident, whether you're representing a particular group, how you can be involved in the process as we move forward through the process, not just in terms of your involvement in that, but in terms of your, I suppose, the ultimate delivery. So I'm hoping it's given you a taster. This is a taster at the start. Clearly, we're going to come back and speak to you throughout the process, and we want your engagement throughout the process. So thank you for your enthusiasm, for attending this evening. Hopefully, you've gauged our enthusiasm in terms of our commitment, in terms of delivering this, in terms of something that works. And we will send out a recording, and we will follow up with a Q&A after this as well. So thank you for your time, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.